Good afternoon, everyone. In an exhibition with so many gifts and pleasures, this is going to be a really extraordinary afternoon. So I really, before we begin, I want to thank all of our panelists for giving their time. And also thank you to, we have the whole family here. We have Ficre's two sons, Solomon and Simon, fiancée Alana, mother-in-law Adele, and of course Elizabeth Alexander. So I'd like to everyone just thank you to the family. So I'm Mary Sabatino. I'm the vice president at Gallery Lelong, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this wonderful panel discussion on Ficre Ghebreyesus, Color is Supreme. And I'm honored to introduce our incredibly esteemed speakers and to share about them, but of course there's more information on the website. Dr. Lowery Stokes Sims, old friend, who last evening received the, of course, very well-deserved Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of Curators. Lowery is a specialist in modern and contemporary art, craft, and design, and is known for her interest in bringing a diverse and inclusive global art world and her support of artists whose identities and work reflects those values. Sims served, this is so modest, she served on the education and curatorial staff. She made the curatorial department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she was executive director and president of the Studio Museum of Harlem. She retired as curator emerita from the Museum of Art and Design. She organized the 2019 exhibition, Ficre Ghebreyesus, City with a River Running Through It, with Emily Kuhlman at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. Of course, she doesn't mention the 500 other exhibitions that she did that have completely renovated art history. Pamela Franks, behind me, I'm sorry I have to stand in the middle for this part, is the class of 1956 director at Williams College Museum of Art. She's a specialist in modern and contemporary art, and she has devoted her career to unlocking the potential of college and university art museums, working with students, collaborating with artists, fostering inclusive academic and public engagement, and training future generations of museum professionals. Serubiri Moses is a Ugandan curator and author based in New York City. His writing is primarily concerned with theories of art and exhibition histories. His exhibitions are rooted in methods of collective teaching and listening, something very important for us to think about today. He serves as part-time faculty in art history at Hunter College CUNY and is visiting faculty at the Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College, and is contributing editor at Eflux Art Journal. Smooth, I have my back to you. Nzewi is an artist, an art historian, and the Stephen and Lisa Tannenbaum Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He leads the Africa group in the museum's Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives, MoMA's Research and Exchange Initiative focused on art in a global context. Dawit Petros is a visual artist and educator whose work is informed by intertwined and multitive narratives of African and European colonialism and modernity. He draws from his study of history to examine displaced or forgotten histories and archives, conducting extensive research and travels to inform production across materials and mediums, including photography, sculpture, screen prints, video, sound, and performance. So I thank you all. I'm hoping you've all silenced your phones, and then after we will have questions, and I'll bring the microphone to whoever is answering the question. This will be recorded. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll just dive in. Of course, I had a whole list of very pedantic, academic questions, and had lunch with Pamela and Dawit and Mary, and they just threw everything out. So I'm going to have to improvise here and there, but we'll get through this together. So I want to start with, see, it would be you. I thought you were my friend. Anyway, Pamela, I want to start with you because you knew Ficre in New Haven when you were working at the Yale University Art Gallery. Can you talk about how you got to know him and his work and what it was that impressed you as an artist?
Yes, yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for the question. I arrived in New Haven for the first time, really, at all in the summer of 2020. Excuse me, of 2000, summer of 2000. And it was a totally new place for me. I was just finishing grad school. I was starting a fellowship at the Yale University Art Gallery. And the thing that I was probably most excited about, actually, was the chance to engage with the Yale School of Art and the students there. And so, you know, I landed, I settled, I kind of found my perch at the museum. I started working on my project there, but I, you know, quickly started trying to figure out who the incoming class was going to be. And it was an extraordinary group of artists and all different stages of their development. But Ficre's work really stood out. And it stood out because there was just this incredible sense of color, pattern, the rhythm of the work. There was a momentum there that was really clear and observable. And it was clear that he was dedicated to this practice and had been for some time. And so it was exciting to me. I kind of had this feeling like, can I be this in love with the color that I'm seeing? Can I be feeling this painting so much? And it was great because it was really like one of the things that I was so looking forward to doing while I was a fellow at the Yale University Art Gallery. And the other artists were really exciting too, but the prospect of getting to know these artists' work over the next 2 years was really exciting to me.
Now, it's interesting to me, over lunch, you talked about some of the artists who were part of his cohort. Could you tell us who they were?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't actually thought about it before lunch, so I'm not going to be able to recite the entire group. Right. But McLean Thomas was part of that group, and Matt Saunders was part of that group. So if you know these two artists' work, they're very different from each other, right? And then there were just artists who were spanning kind of the full range of approaches. You could tell that some were coming right out of a BFA program in art school, some were coming out of a university setting and sort of thinking about their kind of more intellectual background and trying to kind of bridge the move into art school. But it was an interesting kind of cohort, and but again, I really felt that Ficre's work, and at that point I hadn't seen that much of his work around New Haven, but soon I would. I really felt that there was, you know, this kind of continuity of practice already in place that was really beautiful, and it was exciting to think about where it would go, and in dialogue with the other students and with the faculty.
So when he arrived in the United States, I mean, he studied liberal arts at Southern Connecticut State University. He did film in New York. He worked in the Art Students League, Bob Blackburn's printmaking workshop, and the Creative Arts Workshop in New Haven. So how do you think those experiences sort of informed what you saw in his work when he got to Yale to work on his MFA?
I think the kind of embrace of abstraction feels connected to the Art Students League in some way. I'm sure there's many other things that it's connected to. I think there was a real sense of, like from the very start of seeing his work, a real sense of experimentation and a kind of, what I saw at the time as a kind of incredible bravery and, you know, not fearlessness, but, you know, there was pain and there was kind of a real human feeling, but there was a bravery and a kind of, but then there was also this joy and hope that came through to me, and I you know, there's a lot of energy around that. So I think the abstraction coming out of, you know, the various training that you noted, I'd love to kind of go back and see what there is to see in the printmaking background. Right. I don't know that work.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I'd love to see that.
So Moses, I want to bring you into the conversation now. So over the last decade, so there's been an explosion of interest in the art world in artists from Africa, Black artists from the United States and the Caribbean. And it's been interesting. We've seen artist profiles and values rise and fall. How should we see Ficre's work in that context? And if so, how?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between an artist like Ficre with an artist like Wangechi Mutu, for example. I understand that they, I think both are Yale alums,
Yes,
yeah. But I think it's quite important to distinguish, and for the mere reason, I think that contemporary art curating, which has led to this boom. Wow, there's a bit of an echo. Contemporary art curating, which has led to this boom, I think has really defined how we read these works, right? Like, so I think Smooth, you will agree with me when I talk about the way that contemporary art curators have identified the figure as one of the primary kind of ways or lenses through which to understand a lot of Black art or African art. And so, I mean, we see this, of course, with Okwe's and Chika Okeke Agulu's contemporary African art since the 1980s, when they identify the figure specifically as like one of the outstanding features, like going through Yinka Shonibare to, you know, a number of other artists. So Ficre's work is, I think, I don't want to be controversial, it's particularly American in the sense that it's quite abstract. And there's also a very kind of fluid language, which is not a particular static kind of abstraction. I think he kind of goes into abstraction, figuration, and, you know, and sometimes it looks quite abstract, right? Like the piece that's right behind you over there. So in that sense, I think that even though there has been a boom of African artists, I think his work, in my view, is not necessarily at the core of what curators have been promoting. And I say that with respect to the figure specifically, figurative work, but also when it comes to conceptualism more abstractly, so film and photography in that regard.
It's interesting that you use the term American for his work, because I think in a conversation that Elizabeth had with Jason Moran, he talked about what context to sort of put his work in, because he had done so much studying in the United States. I don't know, Smooth, if you want to sort of, you know, take that one.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, so I wouldn't, you know, it's interesting to hear Moses sort of think of him outside of the canon of African, contemporary African art. And I think, you know, there's a certain milieu of the diaspora where that space, that interstitial space, where certain artists hold that space to be able to look back at the continent and look also to the diaspora. And I think he's one of the artists who fully occupies that space in interesting ways. And so, yes, of course, he has an incredible abstraction, you know, very with vibrant colors and all of that, you know. But I think, you know, for me, the way in which I was thinking about his abstraction is really that space of, you know, where it holds that space where things can be revealed, but also can be concealed, which is really a metaphor thinking about a lot of African art historically. And so at that level, I think his access to African art is really from a very cerebral perspective. But even in his visual language, he still references not just, you know, not just the cultural memory of his past in Eritrea, but you know that he's also looking to visual forms from historical African art. I mean, I'm thinking about the work we have at MoMA, where, the nude with a bottle, with the equestrian figure, and that work is Yoruba. And then when you look at his sketches, some of his sketches, you see that there's a deep dive into African art forms, into the cultural memory of the continent in ways that the diaspora do a similar thing. But I think his is also very much grounded in lived experience, and so I wouldn't necessarily describe him as, just as an American artist. I think his experience captures, what he does is similar to what Skunda Boghossian was doing, the sort of referencing, from West Africa, from the Habesha heritage and all of that, and be able to position that within a language that is very modern and international.
Dawit, did you want to weigh into this?
What I think I wanted to add was that when I came to the show on Friday, it was an incredibly emotional experience. And in a sense, the language that I was utilizing for me felt like a sense of homecoming. In that we walked through the pieces with Mary. Part of what I was able to describe to her was, first is the multiplicity of languages and aesthetics that were legible to me in terms of what is in the Eritrean cultural landscape, both within Eritrea, but also within the community, within the homes that Eritreans build from place to place. But to return to this question of abstraction and the way in which abstraction and figuration are handled, what was the homecoming for me was I finally understood the thing that I was struggling with, which is that they're not in contestation with one another, but that there's a way in which I don't think there is they're being positioned in antithetical to one another. And I say that because modes of abstraction and representation and modes of figuration are everywhere within us, are everywhere within within the cities, both in terms of the textual traditions, the architecture, the way in which food and things are presented. And so, it's, to me, he's both, he occupies so many multiple places, but I definitely do situate him within an Africanist, and specifically, I would say, within a set of East African traditions.
Yeah, I want to sort of dive into this whole aspect of how we in the so-called West, are looking at this whole cohort of African artists. I was struck in the research I was doing that the London-based novelist and blogger Chibundi Onunzo criticized the fact that the art world would tend to look at the work of these artists through the lens of Western art history or represent them as standalone phenomenon that belong to no recognizable tradition. And her point was that criticism often does not take into consideration the lineages of contemporary art that can be discerned in the history of different African countries. So, Moses, you've built a case for national art histories for modern and contemporary art, noting the influence of artists that some are not even known yet into the West, who provided the path for the current generation of artists. Could you elaborate on this a little for us?
Yeah, I feel like, Lowery, you're putting me in the spot. I've said so much. I've said so much in our dialogues that I think that the question of like a kind of national art history, particularly a kind of Ugandan art history, for me, I think is about recognizing, at least what I'm thinking about now, as a kind of mode of reading or a context for reading. So I recognize that there are particular sort of traditions, but traditions of criticism in particular. Also traditions of, some which are, I think, also visual traditions, or I would say more so critical, I think, critical traditions, right? Like that, and to call them traditions is elaborate, right? But practices, maybe a few or 3 or 4 or 5 kind of writers who shape how we can read certain. And in my view of Ugandan art, and I was really thankful to Smooth to invite me to write an essay on Teresa Musoke for MoMA, the platform post, because I think there is there's a darkness, I should put it that way, and a sort of like somberness, a gloominess to Ugandan, or particularly East African kind of traditions in that sense. And I think there is something there which is locatable in the variety of experiences that go straight all the way back from the, perhaps 18th century, but, we could come closer as well to as recent as like Sudan, Darfur, etc., or to the war in northern Uganda, for example, with Joseph Kony. I think we can talk about these different events, but I think there is something in those artists which has quite often been mistranslated, which is that they prefer to think almost pessimistically. I don't know how else to frame that. They're not afraid of thinking about the world that is going bad or is going badly. And in some ways that's where they begin to interrogate. And so that's why I would say that there is something of a tradition, although really a group of writers who have helped to shape that. I mean, one example is the writer Tabanlo Leong, who is a Ugandan poet who studied at the University of Iowa, and he also studied at Howard in the 60s. He said that East Africa is a literary desert, right? He said East Africa is a literary desert. So when people listen to that, they think, was he being cynical? But that is the kind of mood and temperament of East African artists and writers and intellectuals. They're not afraid of confronting something which is spare, void, dark, somber, or even something that is very honest and truthful, such as that, yeah.
Dawit, over lunch you were talking about the whole idea of artists in East Africa, or say Eritrea in particular, approaching things on a kind of coded level. Does that sort of segue to what Moses is talking about in terms of?
Absolutely. I think on the one hand is the complexity of the lived experiences, the historical experiences, make it difficult to address things on a surface level, right? To be direct with what your observations are, and so the language, the formal language of the piece behind you here, the manner in which Ficre is sort of excavating to show the surface, for me is both a strategy that allows me to understand as the viewer of the work functions like a score. How has the image come into existence? But part of what it also compels me to think about is the way in which that becomes a metaphor for addressing those things which you cannot address directly. And so the object which comes into the world, which has both its surface that is marked in a particular manner, but part of what I understand in that gesture is a reference to that pessimism, those incredibly complex sets of experiences that have a real, in certain instances, life or death implications if you share them. And so what I think is happening is quite sort of quite in par with what you've just addressed here, Moses. Yeah, so this is definitely something that that makes sense to me in that regard.
I was, like my favorite story is that what I called my sort of COVID boredom project in 2021 is between the months of March and September. I started just collecting all these images of works by people from the African diaspora, mostly Africa, that would come, over my phone and, over the computer. And by September, I had 500 individual images. So then, the art historian kicked in. All right, we're going to categorize this. And it was totally impossible. One of the things I was struck by, which I think fits, you two have just sort of explained to me, is that I didn't see any kind of like real didactic treatment of the world events that I knew was happening, like all over Africa. There was like, maybe it was the optimism that, you were talking about, Smooth or something. And so I just think how one of the things that we lack, in our context is the perspectives of individuals from South Africa who can sort of provide these kinds of nuances that sort of really break with, people who have ideas of what, political polemic should be about and how you sort of attack, different things. Like I was sitting there, so I said, I was going to do it stylistically, and it just didn't work. Each one of them was so different. So I said, all right, we'll do single figures male, single figures female, couples. And then when I started doing the couples, I sort of sat there and went, oh my God, there was like this kind of underlying queer contact that just sort of popped up, and you said, oh. So, it was very, very subtle, and I didn't know if it was a way of dealing with their political reality or maybe a way they were trying to make it compatible for a Western market, in many ways.
Yes and no, I would say. I think the language, in general, the language of African arts or African artists is really a language of sort of a distillation of reality to the very essence, and that's true from history. There's a way in which you engage. Reality is not didactic. You want to find a way of distilling what you consider the, sort of distilling to a language that is encoded, and then that language in itself ultimately gets to be unpacked in a number of ways. But in the reality of the now, I think what was happening, if one was to think about, and we can all speak to this, when I'm sort of speaking like someone who's lived on the continent, you're making art in response to an international mainstream, if you will. But you're also making art that is in conversation with the reality of the everyday. So there are two, so some artists are very successful in able to bring those two together, and some are more successful in, providing works that seem to be speaking, to an international context. And one would be, the figuration, the figuration that was rife during COVID, the figuration that was rife. And I realized that was coming from the perspective of the market, one would argue. But that's not just the entirety of it, There's also, with internally, people were trying to make sense of the world through figuration. What were you going to say?
I was going to just pull the layers a little back and just kind of go a little bit back to the point that was made just now. So the idea that you can't necessarily see things didactically and that there is something happening or hovering under the surface. For me, actually, I mean, I hear your point of view there, but I think for me, actually, it's something that I've wrestled with in my practice, my entire career, right? Since 2009 or something. I was talking about artists who do not make art. And the reason why I was saying artists who don't make art, it was because it's not I was a kind of Russian art historian who is investigating conceptual practices that aren't art, but they are documatter. No. I was thinking about artists who have been censored. So for me, East Africans are always sort of like speaking in this almost like a double, it's not really a double entendre, but it's like almost like a double speak. You have to be able to give them time, almost, like the practice doesn't just open itself up to you like it's for my taking. You have to almost give time to a practice in order to really for it to speak to you, which is, if I may share a little bit, I was very moved by Professor Elizabeth Alexander's statement that she made in one of her essays of waking up every morning and looking at a Ficre Ghebreyesus painting, and really just kind of looking at it every day, like that level of engagement. Every day when I wake up, this is the first thing I see. It's the first color that I see. And I kept thinking that this is the perfect metaphor of how to read this work. Because that's just how layered the work is. Like it's so layered that you can't really see it on the first try. You have to sort of, you have to work. You almost have to work to find it. Yeah.
So, okay, no, please.
It made me think of something actually. It's so interesting to me that there's this very definite date of 1990 when Ficre started painting, but he was really always painting. And this idea of artists that don't make art, but the kind of way of thinking and way of seeing and way of composing daily life or reality as a whole. I mean, that came through so vividly in that particular comment, and it just, you made me think of it again. I don't know if that resonates at all.
And what it resonates for me is in the passage in his text when Ficre addresses that for an artist to operate outside of outside of the church or outside of the convention is a new idea, right? Is a new idea. So I think part of what I recognize in the evolution, both in the text but also in the evolution of the work, is the manner in which Ficre is responding to the educational and the cultural impulses that he's moving through. But then filtering it through. So I'm terrible at math, but I've never done so much math as when I was reading sort of this chronology and attempting to sort of figure out where he was at certain moments in time. And so when he describes, in his application for Yale, what is that, 98, 2000? But in that context, he refers to Eritrea as home. Right, so there's a way in which at that point he has spent more than 50% of his life outside of that geographic context. And so there's still, I think, this attempt to locate or to understand what is being experienced within the various cultural traditions, academic, artistic traditions, and this formative period of being in Eritrea, right? Yeah, so this is, I keep coming back to that moment, I keep coming back to that sentence in the text. And I think all that with just to return to that point of, that there's this literary tradition, which I understand wax and gold, and the manner in which you utilize language to speak in multiple sort of codes, as a way of being able to think about what it can be articulated, what cannot be articulated. But I also think that then anchoring that on a specific lineage of cultural tradition.
Right, yeah. Okay.
Where the
And then I
question-
have another question for you.
Yes, the question you asked Moses.
You're running this, I'm just
Yeah,
sitting here.
the question you asked Moses, which is this, I'm trying to remember how you phrased that question about how are African artists read outside, and has that got to do with and how they are disentangled from a certain kind of lineage that is tied to tradition or history.
Yeah, because I wanted you to sort of talk about, since you're working in a museum, how, taking all this into consideration, how does Ficre's work be, contextualized, or any contemporary African artists be contextualized within, museums like the Met and MoMA, which have these encyclopedic things, and they tend to categorize things very strictly.
Right. Yes, I'm gonna respond to that, but I, for sake of clarity, the reason I want to go back to that initial prompt is, I hear there's a largest East African tradition, but even within the East African tradition, there are very specific traditions, tied to the concept of nation, as it were today. And so when you speak about the the concealment and the layers as part of a broader practice, one of the things I would like to hear is when you begin to silo that off, how does that register, say in Eritrea, which is really what he's responding to directly, and not necessarily the broad, Eritrea Ethiopian context, and not necessarily the much broader East African tradition. And then I'll respond to your question. Yes.
I have a perfect answer. Now, you remember what I was saying about the 17th, 18th century?
Yes.
I mentioned the 18th century. I think this is where we can start to locate this kind of thing. Because what East African artists are responding to is kind of on that temporality. If we start to talk about the way that, why is Buganda, the way that it is, we have to go a bit back, perhaps to the 1700s, and to learn how that specific culture has shaped, ways of speaking, manners of talking. How do you respond? And the language in itself is so encoded with these kind of protocols, right? So one of the things that, and I'm now just learning from my younger colleagues I have a younger colleague called Musoke Naloga who lives in the Netherlands. She's a curator. And she said, the culture that we come from, which is the Ugandan culture, is a caste system. So it was very new to me. I was like, why are you calling it a caste system? This is a majority, it's of course majority black country, majority black, group. But that she said this is a caste system. But what she was talking about were those protocols that are in place. I know that for even in Ethiopia, outside of Eritrea, that is definitely in place. There is a kind of protocol that designates you as part of a social group. Like, for example, I'm born in a certain family and so on. For generations, my family has been doing this job and that job, and we have been designated landowners or serfs or cattle keepers or farmers, and that is a very strict kind of boundary, right? So this is how I should say Kenyans and Ugandans always end up into fights. Because in one way, we all share a kind of pastoral tradition. We have a sort of cattle keeping tradition where we are herders and we have cattle. Same in Rwanda. We have cattle, and so the idea of being pastoral means you can find home anywhere. You can enter into any space and announce yourself. But at the same breath, Uganda is bracketed by this kind of Buganda, almost like, how should I say it? The Buganda history, the history of the Buganda people, which is really, I don't want to say too much about it, but it is a slave-owning tradition. It is one that has made other people slaves of its own, So we come from that. So that creates a kind of caste system that is even passed down in the language itself. So I cannot speak really definitively to Eritrea, but I know that at least in Uganda that is what we're referring to when we talk about the kind of double speak. Where am I at this point in time? Who am I speaking to? And how am I being, what is the mode of address at this point? And I experience it a lot with the, I'm sorry to keep mentioning Ethiopian, but I experience it so much with my Ethiopian colleagues. Like, why are you apologizing to me? Like, they apologize all the time. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. Like, why are you apologizing? You didn't do anything wrong. But it comes from this kind of caste system that has designated some people beneath others, that therefore they always have to apologize, unless they were. So that's how I would answer it, Smooth. Because also in Uganda, I think, I'm sorry to kind of belabor this point, but just to say one last thing. Yes, there is such a thing as having been raised in a family of quote unquote landowners or quote unquote people who are royal, so to speak, from a kind of aristocratic background, And to those people, you do not address them directly. You do not look them in the eye. You do not claim to know people from their family. You do not insert yourself in conversations in which they are speaking. And up to this day, those rules apply. People will say, what kind of family do you come from? And that will determine whether you can speak or not. Yeah.
But Dawit, you were also talking about the sort of influence of Italy, like in that during lunch, and that was like kind of really interesting because how would that sort of play into this kind of situation?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we were talking about is the extent to which I think that is an under-considered or under-theorized element in terms of understanding both the dynamics that unfold within Eritrea, the dynamics that unfold within Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the larger region of the Horn, both as a historical set of conditions but that have significant impact on events that are unfolding today. I'm deeply interested in Ficre as a figure who, growing up in Asmara in the 60s and the 70s, has access to a significant amount. He's living in a very cosmopolitan environment. Asmara at that moment is, even under the control of the War of Liberation begins in 61, even at that moment, Asmara is a unique place in terms of the repository of Italian modernist architecture, the Italian cuisine culture that is embedded in the food, is embedded in the language. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the Ficre received an education. That would have been the best education that one could have received at that moment from Italian nuns. And so these are integral, I think, for me, to understanding what unfolds in a lot of the work. The grid and the checkered patterns, for example, those recall, that's the ground, those are the sidewalks of Asmara, right? And so that Italian dimension, I think, is an important part. And when he says in his statement that I wanted to return to Eritrea to train the future Giottos, right? So there's a way in which Italy occupies a very problematic, complicated position, both outside of Eritrea, but also within Eritrean consciousness itself, both as the vector through which independence arrives, the nation of Eritrea arrives, but then it's also part of how and why the long war of independence between Eritrea and Ethiopia sort of unfolds. And so, and then the other is, I wish I could have eaten at Cafe Adulis. You see? Yeah, because it's the food, I'm sure, would have been a hybridization of all of the things that that he'd experienced, much of what he'd experienced. But so it's important to me that we think that it's important for me to understand and to think of Ficre not as a conscious synchretizer when he leaves Eritrea.
So he was consciously syncretizing
before. So he would have spoken Italian. He would have spoken Tigrinya. He would have likely maybe spoken Amharinya. He would have maybe spoken Arabic. So by the time he arrives and leaves Eritrea, I'm fascinated in what that kind of a capacious mind would have already been aware of, how he's constituted. And one of these complex things, I think, is the Italian dimension. Yeah.
I think this notion of referring to home or being able to find home anywhere is interesting to me in terms of making home and creating home. And I think it has to do with the creative act of making painting. It has to do with the creative approach to cooking. It has to do with creating community. And that is anchored in different moments and in different places and in different traditions. But it's almost like the notion of making a cosmopolitan perspective, and this idea of bringing together as a kind of constant creative act in every aspect of existence, and that's what I see in the work, and that's what I hear coming through in your comments.
Go.
Your question.
Yes. Well, I was interested. I'm going to fold this into a couple of things because we're approaching the end of our time. In the review of the Iba Ndiaye exhibition in the Met and the Times, Yinka Alujiba emphasized the syncretistic character of Ndiaye's work, which didn't fit certain ideas of national schools breaking with Western modes, which gets into the whole question. I mean, we could talk about trying to Africanize art curricula and how the students said, no, I don't want to do crafts, I want to do paintings because I'm urbanized, the whole thing. But Smooth, working in a museum, so how do you take a person like Ficre, and then how do you contextualize him within the collection, and so that it makes sense and it reveals, at the same time it destabilizes, stereotypes?
Well, I would say, the work we have is currently on view, and
collection gallery called Jungle, which, no. It's the title of Mark Bradford's work, so it has a very specific context, So that was my initial worry, But it's in the context of, and what that gallery does is it sort of looks at a history of practice throughout, the long century. So you have Louis Bourgeois in that gallery, for instance. You have a Bob Thompson in that gallery for context. And so one of the things I see, is when you think of his work in that context, and see the references he's drawn throughout his career from various contexts, that gallery with his work in there is sort of an example of what he calls the conscious synchretizer. I think that's sort of what that gallery does. But to your broader question, how do you treat, in the context of MoMA, I don't necessarily think we, part of the argument we make when we bring a work into the collection is, how does the work fit? Which is always a very difficult question for me, But it's a very easy question with Ficre, because for one, to the point Moses was making earlier, his education is American, so he understands, so he's part of this milieu. His vocabulary is very suggestive of this milieu, such that you can contextualize his work within this milieu. But at the same time, if you take him to, say, an encyclopedic museum, which is different from, say, MoMA, so you take him to the Met, and you want to look at the history of practice within the Habesha tradition, you can also comfortably do that because you're looking at the Coptic references in his work. So I think the work is a shapeshifter in the sense that, it's able to sit well in the MoMA milieu, but it can also sit well in an encyclopedic context.
Well, that might be a very recent development at the Met. Yeah. No, because in 1988, through various circumstances, I got money to bring in a work by an Aboriginal artist from Australia. And that was the year 2 Aboriginal artists were representing Australia at the Venice Biennale. And so there were no dealers. I think the Asia Society had just done their Dreamings, exhibition. And so, but there were a lot of independent dealers who would show up. So I'm sitting there doing this survey of Aboriginal paintings, and I knew immediately we do not bring in anything painted on bark for the 20th century art. I would stereotype it right away. Fortunately, the Cosmos helped me because John Weber Gallery, which represented artists who did with land art, did a show of Anajari Jacamara. So there we have him in the context of contemporary art in New York in a gallery dealing with the land art. I can't tell you the trouble I had getting it in, and I had the money for it. I wasn't even using money funds. And then where to hang it? In our galleries, or do you put it in the Rockefeller wing? I think at some point we had it stored and then the Rockefeller wing borrowed it, and I have no idea what its fate is today. But it's that kind of way that tradition and modernity and contemporaneity just sort of bump up against, the marketplace and sort of confuse everything.
Right. I think, and so if you were to think about the 1990s, and the collection of works by, African artists, there's always this desire for the authentic, whatever that means.
Yeah, right.
In that moment, meaning that an artist like Ficre might not end up in the museum because he draws on several references, So it will be an artist like Sherry Samba, Brûlé Boabre, for example. But in reality, if you after actually studying the works of those artists, that sense of the authentic doesn't necessarily apply to those works in reality. But that sort of how the market framed those artists, in that moment. And it was also in that moment of the 90s where as Western museums were bringing in those artists, other artists, like say Ficre Ghebreyesus would say, I don't want to be an African artist with a label, because it's a way in which they want to be at par with their contemporaries elsewhere and have access into the sort of the system, if you will. And so I think we've gone past those moments. I think there's been changes for great reasons. But what I find very fascinating today, for instance, is when you want to now bring in an artist into a collection, you want to see, did the artist spend time in New York, for instance? Did the artist spend time in Paris? Did the artist spend time in London? So the question of authenticity has since shifted to what kinds of access the artist may have had in Western, major Western metropole, which I find very fascinating as an art historical study, because it sort of shifted, the protocols of reception for those artists. And by doing so, you want to be able to sort of amplify what you describe as the cosmopolitanness of the artist, making that artist able to be a shapeshifter, that it can be in dialogue with contemporaries from around the world, and then the sort of the other references become extra badges of honor if the conversation shifts in a certain direction.
So there's so much to cover, but we didn't bring food, so So Pamela, just because you wanted to talk about the cafe, I was struck in the catalog for the exhibition Polychromasia. Robert First Thompson did a poetic reverie about the food and the ambience at the Cafe Abdullah, which Ficre opened with his brothers in New Haven. How would you say the overall creativity that was evident in Ficre's studio was expressed in the cafe? You sort of alluded to it before, but I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit more.
The Cafe Abdullah was such an incredibly special place, and that, of course, had to do with the food and the unexpected combinations of flavors and just ingredients, I think. It also extended to the physical space and the art in the space. And Robert Ferris Thompson really talks about the kind of energy between the art, the food, and the kind of community. It was the most welcoming place that I could imagine. And as I was describing earlier, I first encountered Ficre's work more through the School of Art, but then kind of understanding the groundedness in New Haven and the way that the kind of sense of belonging actually happened through that cafe, and specificity in New Haven. I mean, it was, from my experience, it was a defining experience of the town and of community. And anytime we had visitors, we took them to the restaurant. It was, we felt you could get really attached, and that's how I felt about the art as well. So I think it's a kind of, you talk about authenticity, is a kind of genuineness, a kind of presence, a kind of fullness of experience that was, you don't come by very often, actually, in many cases, and it was really, really special. And I think it was not segmented. That was the thing. It really wasn't segmented. It was all kind of coming together, and it was really, a beautiful thing. And I think it had a lot to do with actually making New Haven home. I mean, I don't know, because I only know what I know from my experiences of the art and my experiences of the restaurant and some friendships, but mostly it's kind of piecing it together myself. And I see in this work a kind of collage of different meaningful bits that come together and are stronger together, and that was the experience of the cafe, and it was the experience of the art, and there was a real continuity between, and they felt sort of equally kind of committed to making a meaningful life and making a sense of kind of wholeness. That was, really a beautiful thing, and something that I haven't that I feel very lucky to have experienced.
Well, you guys have given us a lot to think about. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
I think we have time for a few questions. Someone, okay, please use the microphone.
Hi, thank you. I think this is just a beautiful show. I wonder if anyone could speak to Ficre's obvious love of the music and how, what and how. I see it in the color composition.
Darwin, you had some good ideas.
For me, it began with the playlist that was put together, right? And the understanding that music was a central part of, Ficre's environment. But I also was, I couldn't help but feel that there's a particular rhythm in some of the paintings, and specifically, I look at that one. I look at that one there, and I was saying earlier to Pamela that there is a very specific rhythm when you're a very particular sort of rhythm in Tigrinya music, which is anchored in a very particular type of a drumming rhythm. And so the way in which, the motif never changes. It doesn't change radically. It just, you have the timing doubles up, right? And so there's a way in which some of the pieces for me evoke this kind of very sort of measured musical rhythmicality that I connect and I understand through Tigrinya music, specifically through Tigrinya. Well, the rhythm, this is embarrassing, but I'm the least musical person in here, but. And then once it builds to a crescendo, and then it double times, and then and then it ends out. And so I couldn't help it, and I also saw it in the writing, the instructions for a painting for me, which were a score. It was an absolute sort of score that moved me through, that moves one through, and that also had a very particular rhythm. The lines, right? So this is how the music comes alive for me in the work.
I'm curious about in what ways to give Ghebreyesus this space of agency in thinking about the term synchretizer. And by this I mean, when we speak about influences, that's his ability to metabolize imperial force, which is always, it doesn't imply but require violence, right? So both the violence of the fascist Italian regime and the transition from an imperial to a democratic government in Ethiopia, and the pressure it forced on Ethiopia, on Eritrea, sort of formation as a nation. So in what ways the curator and the writer responsible to not be euphemistic about influence and syncretizing and try to invite in the experience of resisting and experiencing imperial violence.
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer this question, because I'm not a historian of Eritrea, and I'm certainly not a historian of politics. But I have read from Eritrean historians that when the war happened between Ethiopia and Eritrea, that it wasn't necessarily resolved only, how should I put this, that there were people in Eritrea who were contributing to a desire or a need for Ethiopia to be the dominant force in Eritrea. That there was, quote unquote, also we have to take account of the kind of factions in Eritrea. This is not just like a uniform political, sphere where everybody agrees that yes, we're all against Ethiopia. And I think one also needs to take account of what was happening with the Derg in Ethiopia, and how the mood in that country also changed to become more imperialistic towards Eritrea, and to say the same thing on the other side, that not everybody was in support of the Derg, right? So I think this for me it's very crucial, because I think there isn't just like a blanket statement of one political belief because you're one nation. I think this is really something that we have to dispel. Uganda, for example, has had many people in support of Idi Amin, right? And I've had people attack me saying that, how dare you, but no, the reality is that in this country, there are political factions. And in those political factions, people believe things differently, right? So the question, how does that map onto the question of influence? I do think that it's still part of, you can read it in a very similar sense, where I do think that I'm deferring still here to Dawit, who said that the syncretizing happened before he actually came here, but also that syncretizing includes Italian culture, right? So it includes Tigrinya culture, it includes Arabic culture, right? So I think this is also similar to, I don't want to keep jumping the geographies, but it reminds me a lot of Somalia, right? And we need to think about these nation states as more nuanced places than, it's just a tiny country somewhere in Africa, No, this place has like multiple political views and that are very strong. So there are people who very much in Eritrea are in support of Ethiopia. And then, we have to also think about the complexities of all the other things, like the Italian kind of what was then the fascist regime, right? That was, occupying.
I think if I may, I thought Smooth had alluded to a kind of common experience of African diasporic peoples of dual identities, which goes back to W.B. Du Bois' double consciousness. And I think all of us, if we look culturally, we're all syncretizing. Mm-hmm. My sister lives in northern France, and she's in a town where the Muslim, Chinese, and particularly Algerian identities have syncretized a French culture. When the French Olympics were held 2 years ago, everybody was in a brouhaha because they had a African woman, I can't remember what country she was from, sort of like the sort of highlighted, singer. But that was as part of France. Like you go to France, half of the French people who look very French have like Algerian-based names, and things. And so this whole idea that, like the world is trying to sort of recreate this kind of sort of notion of purity, come on, like people were running back and forth and intermarrying and everything all over the world. And there are very few pockets of pure, untouched, whatever the hell that means, but even that came from someplace else, So I think sometimes embracing the syncretism is your power, mm-hmm. in many ways.
I would say quickly that when he describes himself as, he didn't just say I'm a synchretizer, he said I'm a
conscious, yes,
synchretizer,
conscious.
Meaning that it's always a process in motion. And if I understand that, towards the end of his life, he was studying Mandarin. He was someone who was really deeply interested in language, and so And so that sense of deep interest, not just in artistic languages, but also his interest in multiple ways of being, multiple ways of being in the world, are things that you continue to see appearing in his work as a conscious act of continuous making and remaking and of himself, because he was someone who left home very early, and his sense of being has been that of someone in perpetual motion.
Yeah. I think we had a question over here. Over here, Mary. Right here.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the voyage of color, the vibrancy of a refugee, the migrant, his early work, when you were speaking about the somberness and work, his early work was somber, and to also look around the room and feel the vibrancy of the colors, the pastel. How do we, how do we, not position, but how do we investigate and understand the way that color traveled through Ficre's work? And is there a language to that vibrancy and that somberness across the time?
I'll just quickly reference Elizabeth's, where, and it's not just referencing it, but, there's a way in which, that sense of groundedness and home happened when he had a family. Yeah, exactly. And then his color also transformed, The early moments in the 90s, his works are really dark, and in that moment, there was a lot of deep, home in many ways was still, it was directional toward Eritrea. But the moment he found a reason for fully placing himself in the diaspora, something transformed it as well. Some might argue that, part of going through Yale also had an impact in how his work shifted, but I would say, that the sense of joy, joy of leaving, and placement came with when Solomon and the brother came and all of that, and you see that in the work, their aliveness, the work becomes fully vibrant because it sort of found something that kept him very grounded.
So thank you all so much for all of your insights, and it's so wonderful and a bit of an uncanny experience, a wonderful experience to hear people, Pam, of course, his friend, but to hear people come to the work anew for us to listen, so thank you. And I just wanted to say a few things that I think are important. To pick up on the title of the show, Color Supreme, music. I am exhilarated by what you say about that rhythm, which I'm hearing in my head too. And also, of course, I'm sure everybody sees, and it's so exciting that there's a playlist for the show. The influence of jazz itself. I just having looked at this all this time, there are the piano keys over there. There's the piano referenced in that big, heavy, dark area up there. The instrumentality is everywhere, as well as the movement and the energy. So I think that's a really exciting thing to think about. The context, the jungle room, which he would actually think that was hilarious. As an African from no jungle. But what I love about that room at MoMA is that I think it's making a really interesting, very almost wacky diasporic argument. And so also to Bob Thompson in there, again, there's Bob Thompson. Bob Thompson's all over this show, someone who we love very much. But also there is the amazing Haitian artist whose name I've forgotten, and Rousseau, which thinking about things that happened. He was a very intense and inveterate museum person when he came here, and when he was in New York and in New Haven, the Met and MoMA were places he would take everyone who came to visit, friends, family. That you probably remember being taken as a child, that at MoMA it was a different MoMA than Rousseau's Jungle felt somehow like a black moment. He loved that painting. So even though it wasn't really a black moment, it was a different kind of European moment. So that was of tremendous interest to him, and I love that for his placement. To what you're saying about the syncretization happening, and I just want to hear everything you have to say about Asmara and what you see in the paintings, because I wish I could see that myself. But of course, the Asmara you described, the architecture, tremendously, tremendously important experience as a child. So when he would talk about, the architecture of the movie theater, it was being a cinephilic child who, along with that, came gelato. That was sort of the entirety of the experience imprinting itself upon him visually. And what I also want to add to the syncretization that happened in Asmara was other things were coming in, which is to say a musical landscape that included James Brown from his older sisters, Sam Cooke from his older sisters, Fela Kuti from somewhere, I don't know, because his sisters weren't bringing that music, but it was in his mind. So again, I think there is, one thing that he and I share and that we really fed in our relationship is he was a child, we were the children of the short century, of African and Caribbean independence, of the civil rights movement, of freedom movements in the United States. He grew up in the journey of Mandela's Africa, which is to say, when you see all of those years from the righteousness to the long imprisonment, and then look what happens on the other end of it. And so I think that it's a very, very complex Pan-Africanism, and that, what did it mean to try to think about it and make that in its tremendous complexity, right? All of these countries, all of these histories, all of these places. But the exhilaration of independence in one whose, whole life basically was the independence war. And also just to the history, I do want to say, just to be super clear, because history is important, he didn't know anybody who thought anything was okay about Mugusu Hailemariam or the Derg, or like that. That was the fundamental suffering. So we shouldn't have there's no fuzz around that. So I think that that's exciting, because I think that if painting is the place, if art making is the place where all of those images and ideas that you hold inside for so long can finally make expression, that's what I see happening here. And again, I'm really excited by the idea that, one more thing from just before leaving Eritrea, the picture that you see in there of the three sisters of his, the little collage, right? So, and again, to my Pan-African argument, Sada has, I guess he would say not an Afro, but Afro hair, which for him was, Angela Davis's iconic Afro was highly globally imprinted on him, as well as women freedom fighters' Afros, right? So those things are coming together. And then the elder sister Tadu with her beautiful, and then Mehret with her magical, so these African women who are moving in the world, Tadu has gone to Ethiopia, Mehret has gone to Hampton University, so she's with American Black people, that movement is encoded in there in a time when all of the African studio photography that we're so excited by now, the Keitas and the Sidibés, blah, 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 he hadn't seen that yet. But of course, he's still playing with family photographs that are made in that tradition. So much, and I'm just really appreciative of the things you see and want to pick your brain. Yeah.
To our amazing panelists, please, everyone, thank you. It's been an afternoon where I think all of us, even those who may have known Ficre, have learned something. So this is really a gift. The exhibition will continue through next Saturday, and next Saturday in the afternoon we'll have our closing event, which is a musical interlude with composer Leo Smith, and Eli Kessler, and there will be an original composition based on Ficre's work. So if you can join us at 3, is it 3?
Yes.
At 3 o'clock, that would be great. Thank you, Eve. And I also want to thank all my colleagues at the gallery and who all have worked so hard. To our undying gratitude to Elizabeth, a special shout out to Solo, who together with Rita found SCORE and has brought so much more to the exhibition. So thank you, Solo. Thank you, Rita. Thank you all for being a beautiful audience. Thank you.